Welcome to Jefferson's West, Lewis, Clark, and Native American Summer Series. Hi, I'm Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. Today's panel discussion is Lessons Learned about Jefferson's West. This is our final program of this series. We hope you've enjoyed the lectures and are looking forward to the discussion this afternoon. Should you have a question during the program, kindly add it to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This program is being recorded and will be available in a week or so in the Lifetime Learning's podcast library. Also, live captioning is available today should you need it. We have 4 notable faculty involved in this discussion. Our lead faculty for the Jefferson's West, Lewis, Clark, and Native American series is Alan Taylor. He is moderating today's discussion. Alan Taylor is the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History and the UVA's Cochrane Department of History in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. He joined the faculty in 2014 after teaching at California Davis for about 20 years. Alan has assembled a stellar group of colleagues from across the country for the Jefferson West series. They include Colin Calloway, the John Kimball Jr., 1943 Professor of Native American Studies at Dartmouth College. Elizabeth Fenn, Distinguished Professor, Early American Native American History at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And Ann Hyde, Professor of History in the Department of History at the University of Oklahoma. Now, I'm pleased to turn the program over to our lead faculty, Alan Taylor. He's done a great job at moderating the discussions for the last 2 weeks. Alan, the program's all yours. Take it away and have a great time.
Well, thank you, Althea, and thank you for all of your help with this program. This really couldn't have happened without you. And I'm grateful for your team, Mary Lynn, Ashley, Dana, for all of their help. One of the things I'm most grateful for is that I was given the opportunity to select people to work with, and I couldn't have asked for a better set. And all 3 agreed to do this, so this has really been a dream come true for me to work with Ann Hyde, Colin Calloway, and Lil Fenn. So how we're going to handle this today is that I'll pose some questions for our entire group to discuss, and that may take about half of our time. And then I'll open the floor up to questions that you all post in the question and answer section. And we're particularly interested in thinking about the expedition as a whole and to think about its impact on the United States and on Native peoples living west of the Mississippi River. So my opening question for our panel is, for each member, is there anything that you'd like to add, something that you may wish in retrospect that you'd included in your presentation, anything you'd like to put on the table right now for us to think about? So the floor is open.
Well, I will pipe up then and say that the one item that I did not manage to squeeze into my presentation and I would have liked to address is the smallpox of 1781. Luckily, Professor Calloway addressed it in his presentation, so I felt I could set it aside. But this was an epidemic that contributed to new power dynamics on the Northern Plains. And as Professor Calloway indicated, it realigned so many positions among Native peoples, reducing farming peoples like the Mandans, Hidatzas, and Arikaras who lived in dense settlements, and then conferring an epidemiological advantage to more mobile peoples like Lakotas and Blackfeet. Shoshones too were affected, and the demographic total on Shoshones, I think, remains to be ascertained.
Okay, great. Anne, anything you'd like to add?
I was thinking about this when we started, but one of the things that's really changed in the last, 10 or 20 years maybe, is there's new research tools that enable us to do some research we couldn't do before. Just, one example might be the fact that all of the journals are digitized. So now you can do searches for things like people's names, how often they're mentioned. You could look up salmon and whether it was attached to a curse word. How often are dogs mentioned? But so you can do a different kind of analysis using those digitized texts. The other thing that I think shifts up the way we've thought about the journals is we can compare versions now. So what did Nicholas Biddle's look like versus what Clark produced in the field? So we know a whole lot more about how crafted these things were. And I think that's changed the way we look at them. There's very little that was really done on the fly. So these are very much crafted narratives. So I think that's worth thinking about.
Colin, any thoughts?
Yeah, I have something I wish I'd had a chance to say more about and something I would have liked to have added. And the first one is basically indigenous power. I mean, we talk a lot about the Lewis and Clark expedition being the kind of first step of American empire in the West. But I think we now know from other people's scholarship, I should say, that the West was a place of growing native powers and even indigenous empires. So that when Lewis and Clark collide with the Sioux, that's a growing American empire clashing with a growing Lakota empire. And a similar phenomenon is happening on the Southern Plains with the emergence of the Comanches. But the people I want to mention is someone that Jefferson mentions. He says to Lewis and Clark, when they're heading west, you've got to watch out for these two groups of people. One is the Sioux, and the other is the Osage, who don't really figure much in American history because they don't wage major wars against the United States in the 19th century. But if you look in American sources, you don't see much about them. But if you, in the Spanish and the French sources in the 18th century, everybody knows about the Osage. They dominate between the Missouri and the Red River. And they too are an indigenous empire, not in the way that the British were or the Romans or even the Americans, but these are major power blocks. And I think it helps us to understand what Lewis and Clark are getting themselves into, to understand that. The other thing I wanted to mention very briefly is native maps. Native people draw maps for Lewis and Clark all across the way. So Lewis and Clark may be explorers, but they're exploring with the knowledge provided to them by native people. And there's a neat incident where I think Calloway not only draws them a map, but actually creates a 3D map for them to show them the Rocky Mountains. And the more I look at that incident, I kind of get the impression that Calloway is thinking, so guys, you're not getting it. You're not understanding what it is you're trying to climb. Here, let me build a mountain for you. And I think there's a lot of instances along the way where those contributions by Native people are easily overlooked, but they're often there.
Great, thank you. In studying the Lewis and Clark expedition, studying the region west of the Mississippi River during the early 19th century, in recent years, is there something that in particular has shifted your thinking as you've learned more about these topics?
Well, my answer to this is actually pretty brief. I don't think it's so much a shift in my thinking as a new awareness that's shaping my scholarship, which is that I've been surprised to find how attached, and now I'll generalize, how attached Americans in general are to this expedition and how hard it is to supplant that triumphalist narrative of undaunted courage with a more honest, nuanced, and realistic narrative that still portrays intrepid travelers. I mean, you know, this is a hard expedition. But I've been really interested by how powerful the hold of that triumphalist narrative is.
Mhm. Anne or Colin?
I can jump in here, and I think this is very much related to Lil's point, and something that Colin said just a minute ago. Kind of what did Lewis and Clark get themselves into? Because the key issue is they're jumping into the middle of something, and not only is it changing Native relationships, you know, political power. They're changing imperial relationships too, and changing business. So I think one of the pieces of scholarship that I think has shifted the way I think about this is how important the fur trade was to every other empire. So to the English, the Spanish, the Russians, they're very invested in the fur trade. And the only way that the fur trade works is with these very personal relationships with small native bands. And the US is a little hesitant to get, they would like to be involved in this commerce, but I think are a little hands off about what it's going to take. You know, it involves taking native businessmen and personal politics seriously. So I think understanding kind of how behind the curve the US actually was when Lewis and Clark went out is important.
I'd like to pick up on that. It seems like these other empires would very much like the fur trade to be an ongoing enterprise for many years into the future, whereas it seems American political leaders regard the fur trade as something that should be evanescent, that it should be supplanted by American settlement and American mining and American logging and other forms of exploitation that will be much more transformative than the fur trade even was. Do you think that's right?
I do, but if you look at early native policy, I think it's completely two-faced. So there's all this stuff about we need to get land away from native people. So you can look at the earliest, you know, the 1784 and 1785 land grant policy, that sort of stuff. But at the same time, they're setting up a fur trade system that's modeled on the British with these big factories. So for a while, they're traveling along both paths. So the early 19th century, I think they're trying to do both.
Okay, great. Colin, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I'm not sure I've been surprised, and my thinking is on this is not recent, but one thing that I've appreciated over the many years I've been working and reading the Lewis and Clark journals is how much I continue to get out of it that's new. That is new to me. It's always been there. I just haven't seen it. And I've just flagged a very short passage that I'll read. This is in October 1804, where Clark writes in his journal, it's on the Missouri. The chief tells me of a number of their traditions about turtles and snakes, and of the power of a particular rock or cave on the next river, which informs of everything. None of those I think worthwhile mentioning. Now, I think the first time I read that, and probably the first several times I read that, I probably agreed with Clark. So, well, that probably doesn't require much attention. But one of the things that working with, well, I'm the only non-native person in my department, so I'm always working native scholars and students, is that I've realized in that instant, what's actually happening is that the chief is actually giving him some very good information, right? And indigenous stories attached to place tell about those stories, have all kinds of information, etc., etc. But clearly what happens is that Clark just switches off, right? As I did, right? And I think the more I understand and learn about indigenous ways of knowledge and learning, etc., we can better appreciate what's in the journals, but also appreciate times at which Lewis and Clark missed things, in which Americans and Native Americans, even as they're trying to communicate, are actually talking past each other. And that's often one of the, in addition to all of the bloodshed that goes into American history, that's also one of the kind of tragedies here.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question.
Oh, could I jump in
go ahead. Go ahead.
Colin's comments, which I agree with 100%. And I think one of the things we can tease out of that particular episode is the importance of that rock, which turns out to be an oracle stone located up the Cannonball River, where Mandans and Hidatsas go once a year. They wet it down with water and then watch the images that emerge. And it's a wonderful opportunity for us as historians to tap into indigenous traditions and oral histories. That oracle stone, it remains in use to the present day.
Yeah.
It's a really wonderful example, Colin, so thank you.
And it's neat because later on there's a moment when, I can't remember if it's Lewis or Clark or both of them, they're complaining about how their native informants are not helpful. Well, how do you know? You weren't listening.
Well, let me ask a couple of follow-up questions. First, just about that stone. Is that stone still intact? Is it? Yeah. Okay.
It is still intact. Yes.
Yeah. And is it a place that Native peoples continue to conserve as something special to them?
That is the case. It's located on private land. You've got to take many dirt roads to get there, but it remains accessible to Native peoples today, and they continue to use it. You can visit it, and you'll see offerings of tobacco, carvings in the rock of animal footprints and things like that. And then this lichen, which reveals images and prophesies the future when people pour water over it.
And another follow-up question, which for Colin certainly, but for all of you, as you read the journals, are you struck by the capacity of Lewis and Clark to become more sensitive to Native peoples and Native cultures over time as they spend more time with them? Or are you struck by kind of their inflexibility and the retention of the core ideas that they had at the start of the expedition?
I think my sense of it is that with Lewis, maybe it's the reverse. I mean, I think Anne talked about some of this last time, how once they'd reached the Pacific, well, that was it. That was the important stuff done. And then they're kind of just waiting to go home. And I see a decline in Lewis's engagement with Native people. It becomes much more irascible, much less sensitive, sympathetic, perhaps. That's my sense of it. And I don't see that in Clark, but I see that in Lewis.
Anne or Lil, do you have thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the interesting things about this is why the Nez Perce are such huge favorites. So what is it about the moment in the expedition, the particular people they meet? I mean, it is situational. So it's definitely the immediate context of, oh, we got over those mountains and now we're in this place. But the Nez Perce make a real choice to be nice to them and supportive and to actually support the expedition, and other groups don't. So I think there's a lot we could figure out about, their shifting relationship with Native people, but it definitely moves back and forth.
Yeah, I don't think that aside from Lewis, I don't really recognize any particular sensitivities early in the journals that then dissipate later, aside from the fact that they're in a hurry on the return, and so some of the entries are a little bit more brief. I continue to be amazed at we talked about what Lewis and Clark often missed in their discussions with Native people and what they recorded in their journals, I'm amazed at what I miss when I read the journals. And then I go back to them and I find, you know, oh, there's really something I can tease out here.
That was a point Colin was making as well. Is there some character in this bigger story, you know, either a member of this expedition or a native person who interacts with the expedition that you think we should pay more attention to? And you can say, you know, Lewis or Clark if you think that they're understudied. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I indicated in the Q&A when I gave my presentation how fascinating I find Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau to be. And I think more attention to him would teach us about how very worldly the early West could be. You know, here's this Métis, you know, Shoshone young man who's really traveled the world and connects with so many events in the West. And I think he's emblematic of something bigger.
Anne?
How about, I mean, one of the things that I think makes it both hard to tease out and easy to tease out is the very structured, because it's a military expedition, there are very clear rules about whose opinion counts and who's supposed to take notes and what gets remembered. But I think underneath that hierarchy, there are 33 people who participated in this thing for the entire trip. So, you know, figuring out how to read the journals and tease out some of the voices of those people. And I mean, Charbonneau's a really good example of that. But anyone who wasn't a sergeant basically is silent. There's one guy who was a private who kept a journal. And there may be other journals out there, but I think there's more you could tease out. So I'd like to hear more from those folks.
Could you say something more about the private who keeps a journal? When you read that journal and you put it side by side with the official Lewis and Clark journals, how is it different?
He got asked to keep that journal, I think starting at Fort Mandan, because someone else had gotten Lewis's disfavor. So he replaced somebody else. So they knew he was keeping a journal, but he complains a lot more. He complains, and I kind of enjoyed this. Like, he complains about Lewis's dog quite a bit because the dog interrupts various things. But you can see much more of the military discipline. So if you got out of line, you had your rations taken away, you didn't get any rum. Sometimes you got flogged. So you can see that in his journal in a way that you don't in Lewis and Clark's.
Good. Colin?
I think, as you might expect, the people I'd like to know more about are native people that they meet on the way. And some of these are clearly interesting, maybe even remarkable individuals, like Black Buffalo in the Lakota encounter, or Twisted Hair in the Nez Perce. And the person I'm kind of intrigued by is, I think it's Black Cat, who I think, Liz, is the principal chief of the Upper Mandan village. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
There's just little hints about him and his relationship with Lewis, which almost reminds me of the relationship that, in Dances with Wolves between Kevin Costner and the Graham Greene character, right, that develops, where Lewis at one point says he asked about our fashions. I suspect fashions means more broadly than what are you guys wearing. But at the end, when the expedition's about to leave the Mandan Hidatsa villages and set off, and Lewis at that point is like a coiled spring. I mean, he's ready to go and eager to go. He takes the time to go and visit Black Cat and say goodbye and smoke a pipe with him. So clearly during the months they were there, something interesting happened between those two guys. It may be just mutual respect, but it's clearly something other than what we're so accustomed to reading about in Native American relationships. So he's an elusive person, but I think there's a clear presence there.
Mhm. Now, you've all in one way or another said that once Lewis gets to the Pacific, he thereafter becomes more irritable, less reflective on Native cultures, more disengaged from participating in the journal. Do you think, when you think about the expedition as a whole, that Clark deserves more credit for its successful return than Lewis?
No question. Yes,
Mhm.
that's what I think.
I agree.
And I think that's on two levels. So first, he does have to pick it up and carry it through some of those hard parts. And then the other piece is, after Lewis takes his own life, Clark has to do all of the hard work of getting those journals published and in some form that's going to make Thomas Jefferson happy, which at that point I think is going to be pretty hard. That was a rough couple of years as Lewis is, not getting those things published.
Mhm.
Yeah, Clark for me too. I mean, when you look at Lewis's conduct on the return leg, in addition to the silences where he seems to have kind of gone AWOL one way or another, there are also some troubling aspects. There's increasing tensions with Native people. There's a scene where the men of the expedition are eating dog, and a young Indian guy tosses a puppy at Lewis, like, making fun of it. And Lewis, instead of just letting that slide, takes the puppy, pulls it back at the young man, and brandishes a tomahawk over his head, and then goes back to eating his dog meal. You could almost just see him going, "Harumph." But I want to return to the Blackfoot encounter. Right? I indicated on last week that I think there's something fishy about that. Right? But even if Lewis is telling the absolute truth, what on earth was he doing going to sleep in enemy country in the face of the enemy? That would seem to be dereliction of duty, to say the least. And then to add to it all, he gets himself shot in the buttocks by Cruiser. It's a sort of Dick Cheney moment for those of you who remember that incident. And so he's actually returning, probably, if he's returning in canoe, he's probably face down rather than sitting in the canoe. It's a kind of disastrous return leg for Lewis, personally, and probably in terms of leadership, I think.
Now, Lil mentioned that there is an enduring fascination with Lewis and Clark and the adventure story of the expedition. And the fact that so many hundred people have signed up and participated in this particular program also attests to that enduring fascination. And I think we can lose sight of that this was one of several expeditions that the Thomas Jefferson administration sent out to probe Louisiana Purchase and beyond. The second most famous would be Zebulon Pike's two expeditions, one to the Southern Rockies and the other one up to the headwaters of the Mississippi. But those are very distant second in terms of public memory and the number of books written about them and other scholarship. Why do you suppose that the Lewis and Clark expedition so dominates our thinking about the exploration of this region by the United States?
Well, I would say that at least two of the expeditions that I'm thinking of, the Freeman and Custis expedition, which was a sort of a southern analog to the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was, again, sponsored by Thomas Jefferson, and Zebulon Pike's second expedition, were both waylaid by the Spanish. And they weren't successful in the way that Lewis and Clark were. And so in that respect, I don't think they appeal to our sort of nationalist, exceptionalist impulse in the way that that Lewis and Clark do. They don't support narratives of patriotism and national unity. I'd also like to add to your question, and with another one, and ask why the remarkable travels of Native American explorers get so little attention. You know, there's this remarkable example of a Yazoo Indian named Moncash Ape, who travels from the lower Mississippi River to Acadia or Maine, and then travels back home again, and then travels via the Missouri and Columbia River to the Pacific, long before Lewis and Clark. So, you know, I think the question you're asking is a wonderful one. I think we can even expand the question itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, there aren't any journals that were published in that time by native travelers, and there's a whole infrastructure that is set up. The wonderful map that we all used in our presentations that's generated by William Clark, and then these journals, and now they're digitized. So that there's an infrastructure of knowledge about the Lewis and Clark expedition that is unmatched for anyone else, including native peoples who we had no idea how many of them crossed the continent. Anne or Colin?
I was thinking about the Hunter Dunbar one, and Lil's right. That one gets waylaid because of the Osage. So they don't get to finish because there are these threats of being stopped by the Osage. So, and it's also, if you look at it, it's Jefferson was thrilled with that report, and it was the first one published, but it's all numbers, and you know, there was this amount of this chemical in the water, and we measured this. So it doesn't have the narrative drama that Nicholas Biddle, I guess, initially put his stamp on.
Well, Jefferson loved numbers. He loved to measure things. Colin?
I think Anne's right. I think there's a number of reasons for it. One is it's a great story. It's a compelling story. A couple of buddies decide to take a road trip across country. We all love that, and especially when they seem to be both compatible and very different characters. That in itself is interesting. But comparing it with the Pike expedition and others, I wonder if what distinctive and perhaps more enduring about this one is it's the Pacific. Right? It reaches across the continent, which is has been Jefferson's dream, and in a country in which the West has represented the future. Right? This is Lewis and Clark maybe personifying young America and making it all the way to the Pacific. I think when you look at, you compare it with other journeys and journals, and Anne's right, some of the other journals, I love journals, and sometimes you order these journals to Interlibrary Loan and they come and you think, that's it. You've got distance, latitude, and weather. The Lewis and Clark journals are great. But I think there's something about that continental reach that plays into this too.
And to pick up on something else that you said, you know, they are extraordinary characters. They're different personalities. If you're going to have a buddy film, you don't want them to be the same personality. And certainly Lewis and Clark are different personalities. And then you've got Sacagawea, who's a compelling character. Even Tucson is a compelling character, and they're all different personalities. And then you have the classic structure of a narrative. A filmmaker friend of mine said, film have 3 acts. First act, you get your protagonists into trouble. The second act, you get them into further trouble. And the third act, you get them out of trouble. And the second act, it seems to me, is they get to the Rocky Mountains and you got that encounter between Sacagawea and Calloway, and that just serves as a pivot that makes this a classic story of you get through that hurdle and then you're on to the Pacific, and then it's fairly easy coming back.
And just to amplify that, if I could, I actually start teaching my class on Lewis and Clark tomorrow, and I call my class American Odysseys, plural. And of course, Odyssey is, the story of Odysseus. 10 years, takes him 10 years to get home from the siege of Troy. But of course, it's there with the Iliad. It's an epic, and I think that in a young country, this story has the qualities of an epic, that it can be part of the almost the origin story of the nation, right? Because it's certainly an important moment as the United States moves towards continental domestic empire and all of that.
Okay.
I think that maybe the best slightly later comparison would be the public attention that John C. Fremont got. And a lot of that is because his wife was such an excellent marketer and writer herself. So Lewis and Clark did the same thing. I think they thought about their audience. They thought about how to craft that narrative in the same way that Jesse Fremont did for John's and his trip. There's a bunch of shady stuff going on. But it goes from coast to coast, even though it takes him 3 times to do it. And there's some dramatic disasters. So it had some drama.
If I might just jump in there, Anne, I'd love to hear too a little bit more, because I think it's clear to me you've been thinking about this, about the particular role of Nicholas Biddle in crafting a narrative for the American public, because I'm always struck by the editing he did, the massaging he did of the story, its characters, what he left in, what he left out. Do you think that Biddle was a big part of the success of this expedition in the eyes of U.S. citizens?
That's a really good way to think about that. Clark is stuck doing this, and he was not expecting to have to do this piece of it. That was going to be Meriwether Lewis all the way. And I think Biddle, Jefferson also trusted Biddle, so they needed someone who had academic chops and writing talent. But he really does shift up the story. But that's, I think, what everybody wanted at that point.
Yeah, and I suspect that made it a more exciting story for the public to read. A Band of Brothers story that's perhaps less nuanced, but more appealing to the reading public at that time.
Now, I've heard several leading Western historians, including Richard White, one of the most accomplished of them all, state that the Lewis and Clark expedition is overrated. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on all of you. Why are they wrong? I'm kidding. You can say it's overrated if you think it is.
I do think it's overrated. I agree with Richard White on this front. For many of the native peoples they encountered, Lewis and Clark's passage was, like the proverbial ship passing in its wake, dissipates fairly quickly. And I think that those native peoples are on their own right, a suggestion that we need to take an approach to American history that's deeper in chronology and wider in geography and demography than our focus on the Lewis and Clark expedition leads us to naturally do. And frankly, I don't think that U.S. history would have unfolded all that differently in the absence of Lewis and Clark. Having said all of that, I'm a fan. I have, at one time I kind of had a bad attitude toward Lewis and Clark, but I have come to be immensely appreciative of the writings of the expedition, which are in their own right a stunning accomplishment. And they are an amazing source of information about the material that Professor Calloway writes about, about the events that preceded them. They are simply stunning in that regard. So I don't want to dismiss them entirely, but in the end, I think I do agree with Richard White.
Okay. Anne or Colin?
I'll disagree.
Okay.
And partly it's what we just talked about above, because Jefferson really did see this huge need in a very classic 18th century Enlightenment kind of way to understand the contours of the continent. So he did set up these expeditions. He's kind of following the path of the British and the Spanish and the French who'd done this before. But he is, so I think that is important. And I think but it's late. So he's doing the 18th century thing at the turn of the 19th century. So again, I think the US is a little behind the curve. But I still think Lewis and Clark and those other expeditions together are important. And the other piece that's important about this, and this is kind of where I'm probably really agreeing with Lil, is this is about Lewis and Clark have to wrestle with the reality of how they're going to make Indian country part of the Republic. And this is going to be a vexed situation. So, I think it's important for that reason. But I do agree that it doesn't change the course of American history. Somebody else would have gone out there and done that work. It might have been fur traders, who knows?
Okay. Colin?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with everybody. I mean, I know what Richard means. And in some ways, the expedition's a failure, right? They don't find a water passage to the Pacific. But I think it can be significant and a success for reasons other than what it was intended to achieve. And one of the questions that I'm thinking about, and Alan, you may know this better than I, or anybody may know this better than I, was the Lewis and Clark expedition viewed as important in the immediate aftermath, right? Or is it only after the journals actually are published and it becomes part of the story? I mean, if they return home and there's cheering in St. Louis and everybody says, well, the expedition kind of started out slow and then fizzled out altogether, that would suggest that, they're not getting a whole lot of bang for their buck at the time. But of course, it's become important in part because of the meanings that we've attached to it since.
Mm-hmm.
And those are not unimportant.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you've all said the importance of the journals and the importance of the map, which transcend any other literature generated by exploration, even the Fremont stuff or the Wilkes expedition later along the Pacific. Those are important things. But in terms of making an impact on the American imagination, I think the publication record that comes out eventually, thanks to Clark, is something that really elevates this expedition and its impact. But you all raised the point that the goals that Thomas Jefferson laid out for this expedition, and the primary goal is try to facilitate American access to the Pacific. It turns out on that particular goal, the expedition, not much of a success. They find a route, but it's a very, very difficult route. But what is your thought about Thomas Jefferson's reflections on this expedition over time? Do you think he was disappointed in the results of the expedition, or do you think he found these other aspects of the expedition that made it more successful by another measure?
I guess I want to answer that by throwing another question out. So
Go ahead.
Do you think by reading the journals that Jefferson or any good Enlightenment thinker might begin to have a sense of how difficult it's going to be to manage the internal kind of colonialism that the US is going to have to manage throughout expansion. So does this raise the bar about how tricky this is actually going to be? There really is Indian country out there.
And that's a great question, and it echoes one of the questions that's come in from the audience, which is, to what degree did the publication of the journals and the map alter the thinking of reading Americans, including political leaders, about the nature of Native peoples? And my sense is it doesn't. That they're perfectly capable of continuing to think of natives in the same terms. They just have an expanded glossary of the names of native peoples and geographic places, but I'm not sure that they really change how they think about native culture. But I would welcome your thoughts on that.
I think you're probably, oh.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think you're probably right, Alan. It sounds to me like a wonderful dissertation to be done, to explore the impact of the Lewis and Clark journals on a wider culture among Anglo-Americans. I mean, one of the obstacles in terms of having an impact on people's, on Anglo-Americans thinking about Native peoples is that the journals were so slow to appear, because Lewis was dragging his feet. I think Patrick Gass published his journal first, and then there's this long lag time till 1813 when the Biddle edition appears. So by the time the journals are accessible, that's yesterday's news. So I'm not sure that they had an impact. I think you're probably right, Alan.
Okay.
I was going to say that I actually think I think you're right, Alan, and I think the journals and the expedition maybe confirms attitudes. Because as we all know, part of the thinking of Thomas Jefferson and American policymakers was that Indian people, if they're going to survive, have to become civilized. And in 19th century American terms, that means become farmers, right? Well, east of the Mississippi, people have been farming for hundreds and hundreds of years. And even the Mandan, the Nadastas, and the Pawnees, and the Omahas on the Missouri River, these people are farming. The problem is, from the American point of view, is the wrong people are doing the farming. You need the men to be farming, not the women. But once they get beyond there, they're into areas like the plains, where Indian people are quote unquote nomadic hunters, right? And so Lewis, and they're not the only ones, Pike, etc., when they come back and say, this is area that's not suitable for American farming, right? But it's okay for hunting Indians. One of the things that does is open up a new possibility, a new dimension, a new avenue, I guess, for the resolution of that inherent problem in American Indian policy that's laid out in the Northwest Ordinance. Right? We're going to take their land. The nation's built on Indian land, and the big story is the transformation of native homelands into American real estate. But we're going to treat them fairly and honorably. How are you going to do that? Well, you can do that by giving them civilization. But the pressure is huge. So what are you going to do with people like the Cherokees, etc.? Because they're making progress towards civilization, etc., etc. Do you really want to be going to war against these people? Now you've got a new opportunity, removal. Right? You can now move Indian people west of the Mississippi to land that's not suitable for American farmers, but it's good for Indians because no matter what lifestyle they've adopted or developing, Indians at root are basically hunting people. And so I think that's, it kind of confirms, as I see it, a lot of Jefferson's thinking and opens up the way toward removal, or what we might call relocation or ethnic cleansing, whatever you call it.
Mm-hmm. Now, Lil mentioned that thinking about the impact of the journals would be a good dissertation topic for some graduate student. I'm wondering if there are other topics that you would recommend to younger scholars that would help us to understand this expedition in this period of time west of the Mississippi better than we already know it.
Well, one topic that I would love to see yet another graduate student pursue is a history of the Arikara or Sanish people. They have an incredible narrative story, and I'm a great believer in narrative history. Yet we have one good book on the Arikara Wars of 1823, but we don't have a real, a tribal study really of the Arikaras, and that's ethnohistory thrives on tribal studies, and it's really a fascinating trajectory. Transitioning, like the Cheyennes from being village people to nomadic to village again. Their relationship with Lakotas is fascinating. Likewise with Mandans and Hidatsas. So I would love to see additional work on the Arikaras. I'd also love to see writing that embraces the kind of pathos that Anne Hyde addressed in her presentation. What about this expedition and its encounters and its challenges, its troubles, and the native people they encounter and their challenges and troubles? What about this speaks to the human condition? Things that we can all relate to in our past.
I think go ahead, Don, sorry.
I was just going to say, one of the things that still surprises me is when we talk about the early West, so the late 18th century, the early 19th century, the Canadian border still matters, and the Canadian border doesn't exist in that period. So a lot, and I think some of the kind of ethnographic work you're talking about, but where people really study travelers, people who moved back and forth, native business people. I mean, there's people who study kind of the bison industry have begun to do some of that, but I think there's a lot of work that could be done around, business practices from a native perspective, but you'd have to go over that, way too powerful border to do that.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And one of my complaints is that so often in American history, it seems that we think we can understand American history by looking only at what happens within America, hedged in by borders that didn't exist at the time, right? And that certainly make very little sense to native people like Abenakis on the Canadian border or Blackfeet on the Montana, Alberta border, etc. In thinking about the question, I feel very much like Lil, at a time when there are increasing numbers, since we're recruiting graduate students, at a time when there's increasing numbers of native graduate students, I think mining the Lewis and Clark expedition for glimpses or starting points to get more at the indigenous experiences and responses to Lewis and Clark. Because I'm a great believer that we can get the perspectives and the responses of native peoples. That not only tells us more about native peoples, but there's also the opportunity that it might tell us something we didn't really see about white Americans, about us ourselves. So I was thinking, can I come up with an example? Well, not quite, but there is an instance on the return journey, and I can't remember whether it's Clark or Lewis, but he makes a comment and he says they're meeting with a group of native peoples, and he says, and there were women there, and he says, and they allow their women to speak in council. Right? And what I think is interesting about that is not so much what it tells us about the political structure and practices of the native people, but of course what it reveals about political practices in the United States. This is worthy of comment because that's not what happens in the United States, right? So there's lots of little things like that. And I think people who are researching the stuff that we're researching from a different cultural knowledge base could provide some very fruitful insights.
Good.
And I agree with Lil about the Arikara because I think the Arikara are fascinating because of their position, the Cheyenne, etc. And I think the Arikara have somewhat been neglected because Lewis and Clark stayed with the Mandans rather than the Arikara. And scholars like Lil have written about the Mandans and not the Arikara, so it's partly your fault.
Okay. So that means Lil will have to do this tribal history of the Arikara.
Naturally.
Yes. Several questions came in that asked for an opinion about Stephen Ambrose's book, Undaunted Courage, or asked if you were to recommend a popular history about the expedition that other than Undaunted Courage. Is there one that would come to mind? So I'd welcome all of your thoughts on that pair of questions.
I would highly recommend James Ronda's Lewis and Clark Among the Indians. It covers the entire expedition and does a really good job of conveying indigenous perspectives on what unfolded.
Yeah, ditto. I was just going to say the same thing. It was one of those books. I mean, it's 40 years old now, probably. But when I read it, it was one of those books where I thought, well, of course, why hasn't somebody done that before, right? And it's very well executed. It's not a particularly long book. It's not like a bestseller, but it's certainly accessible and valuable. Yeah.
I'd add it stands the test of time too. It doesn't read in an antiquated fashion or have antiquated language in it. It's really a wonderful accomplishment.
That brief synopsis that I gave of the Lakota encounter, that's not really my research. That's Jim Ronda's chapter from Lewis and Clark Among the Indians.
Mm-hmm. Now, a related question that just came in, people asked about representation of the expedition on film. So of course there is the Ken Burns documentary, but other than that, even in fictional films, I know that there were some very old films that were done about the expedition. What are your thoughts about the representation of the expedition in film, either fictional or non-fictional?
I haven't watched the fictional films. I use the Ken Burns film in teaching, although with growing reluctance. And the reason for that is that it has to do with something we had talked about earlier, that, you know, Nicholas Biddle massaged the journals into this Band of Brothers American success story. And I think, you know, and later editions of the journal were frankly more honest. They revealed challenges, they revealed Lewis's unraveling. Sacagawea has a greater presence. But that Biddle edition with its Band of Brothers triumphal story, I think because it was first, was the narrative that took hold. And I think it remains the narrative that persists today and that we get in the Ken Burns documentary. So I really urge people to consider the way history changes over time and the way the first tellers can influence the arc of the narratives that we learn.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard to make a movie about sort of the the arc of disappointment. So, this hope that the Northwest Passage really is going to be a thing and Lewis and Clark will be able to prove it. Although I think by the time they're out there, because of information they've got at Fort Mandan and the kind of scene that Colin described, they kind of know this by then. But what kind of story could you tell that wasn't about and I think disappointment is a good story, but it's not as heroic and as sort of easily patriotic.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I have my students watch the Ken Burns documentary as much as anything else for the sort of cinematography and get a sense of the geography, because most of my students are not from the West, and I think it's effective in that regard. Like, well, I have some reservations about the sort of undercurrent there, and I was thinking when Anne was talking about the vote wasn't really a vote, this sort of heralded as this exercise in democracy. I mean, and they Duncan in that moment almost choked up, talking about American democracy. And is that really what was going on? And I think, but that's what we do with our histories, our usable histories, especially if they become an American story. And I think, yeah, your point on about, are we going to have a movie that's sort of an arc of disappointment? I like that term. Yeah, that'll be a bestseller. That will pack them in.
Well, you've all made the point that narratives are double-edged. That on the one hand, they draw us into the story. We want to follow along. There are arcs to successful narratives. There are core characters, and when you've got core characters, that means the people on the margins are thrust onto the margins so that we focus on these central core characters. And there are advantages to that, but there are also distorting effects of that. So I just welcome if you have any more thoughts about how this expedition has been both distorted and amplified by our desire to shape it into a narrative.
Well, that's where I think Colin's hope that we get more Native people looking into this thing to give it a different narrative arc, so that there's a lot of Native storytelling that starts in the middle, and that's actually a much more appropriate narrative arc for this particular story, rather than kind of having it such a clear beginning in Jefferson's brain. There are, all kinds of ways you can make it, and that's a classic narrative riff in media race, but I think that Native storytellers often do that too.
I think, Alan, too, in a sense, what you're describing here is something that we all wrestle with in American history, because all of the work that we do, whether we're, whatever we're working on, is to complicate the narrative, right, at some level. And of course, it's a narrative that resists complication, and that people resist complication because it's a narrative that in some ways serves to define who we are. Okay, I should say who you are, but I'm, technically an American too. In a way,
haven't you been naturalized at this point, Colin? Aren't you one of us now?
I'm still British. I'm still
okay.
Still cheer for Scotland when they play England. But I wonder, as a British person looking at the United States, I'm not sure that in Britain we have a narrative, right, that is so tied to identity, in the way that here it is. And I think we all, whether we're looking at the Revolution or the Clark expedition, a a clear and compelling story that conveys the values that we think we stand for is very resilient.
Mhm.
And the work that and so we get accused of trying to, of almost being anti that story, anti-American. And we've seen responses to that in recent years. And of course, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to get a much richer and fuller history that is a history that everybody shares. But how you get those, if you like, the people being the outliers into that storyline without losing a storyline. Because you're right, I think we are all kind of hardwired for narrative and story. And that's often the tension, I think.
Mhm. Well, I think that's interesting, your point that Americans are particularly wedded to a sense of identity that's linked to historical stories.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, when you grew up outside the United States, when did you first encounter the Lewis and Clark story? Was it, I imagine it was one of the failings of the British education that they didn't teach it in the schools.
No, I didn't. Even when I was a graduate student and I was working in the summer in a arts department, I remember the foreman saying, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I do American history." He said, "What do you do in the afternoons?" So yeah, you have to kind of look for the stuff yourself. But yeah, it was one of those. It was one of those stories that I came across early and was sucked into because of its, I think, the potential to get at what was going on in west of the Mississippi.
Mhm. Well, one of the questions that came in was sort of applauding Anne's mention of Canada, and then you're picking up on that about the artificiality of borders. That we as Americans seem to have taken a pledge to ignore Canada as much as possible. But I find it interesting. I do spend time in Canada and do work on Canada, and as I know that all of you do some as well, especially Colin. I'm struck that the Mackenzie's expeditions, while there's attention paid to them, they don't have nearly the importance in any kind of national narrative in Canada that the Lewis and Clark expedition does.
Yeah,
that's really true. I think David Thompson is a far greater Daniel Boone type figure for Canadians than Alexander Mackenzie is. That's really true.
Yeah. And I would say, from memory, it's a while since I looked, David Thompson's journals are a much better read than Mackenzie's, right?
Right.
By far, I agree. Yeah.
Well, because there's that exciting turning point where he shows up on the Pacific coast and he, upsets the entire Astoria expedition. So, there's this, great twist in it. And Mackenzie, it's sort of, in a way, it's Lewis and Clark's story. He discovers that his native guys were right all along, and it was really, you could do it, but it was impossible to make money doing it.
Yeah.
And Mackenzie writes with complete lack of affect.
Yeah.
Well, I was some years ago, I may be the only American to watch the CBC's entire People's History of Canada in 18 video cassettes. And when you're done watching it, you're left with the impression that the narrative that they chose for their national narrative of Canada was of two different cultures, meaning French and English. So there was some attention to Native peoples, but they basically said Canada is a French and Anglo, two separate cultures that have been obliged to coexist to endure in a very challenging land environmentally. And we can pick apart that narrative as an appropriate one for Canada, but it was interesting just to compare that narrative with the one in the United States, which is much more that anything that Americans put their mind to overcoming, they would overcome. And it's the story of their overcoming all limits in nature.
Mm.
which struck me as very different from the CBC's narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, because Canada is a frozen wasteland, it makes much more sense to interpret it that way.
Yeah.
I don't mean any of that. I'm from Maine. It's the next best thing to being a Canadian. And so any of you Canadians out there, I don't think it's a frozen wasteland.
But I think, you know, as we all know as historians, you know, there's this exercise of not just as historians, but in building nations and national identity, of the exercise of remembering and forgetting. Right? Not all history is treated equal. Not all events are treated equally.
Right.
And obviously, the Lewis and Clark expedition has found a role, has found a niche in the national story.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas, you know, Zebulon Pike, not so much.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't help if you get caught by the Spanish.
Well, there's that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you later get blown up in Canada
Yes.
during the War of 1812. So we got a question which is about the settlement of Oregon. So do we give the Lewis and Clark expedition any particular credit for the fact that the primary place that American agricultural settlers first go to is along the Columbia and its tributaries, especially the Willamette?
You know, it might be fair to give some credit to members of the expedition who became so-called mountain men afterward, who, you know, found routes through South Pass and so on. But once again, I'm not sure that the expedition itself really changed the arc of American history.
I'm trying to remember the passage, and my geography is a little shaky, but it seems to me there are a few points where the journals say this is fertile land, this would be good for American settlement. And it seems to me that there is one in that area of the country. That's not specific enough to be helpful, to be on target, but possibly.
I mean, most of those early settlers are either retired Hudson's Bay Company guys or people who filter up from Mexico. You know, some are American, some aren't. But I mean, Lewis and Clark, they're so grumpy by the time they get to Fort Clatsop. They don't explore much. So, you know, the Willamette River, which they, you know, could have spent some time looking at, they kind of choose not to.
Yeah.
Well, we're almost out of time, so I'd like to give you all an opportunity for a last word. If you, I mean, I think this would be especially valuable to Colin because he has to start teaching this tomorrow. So, what sort of parting advice would you have for Colin?
Yeah.
Can you take your students to go see that rock Lil was talking about?
That'd be great.
Yeah.
I can send you slides of it.
You're probably sworn to secrecy as to where this rock is.
No, I think my parting counsel to everybody on this call would be to read James Ronda's book, Lewis and Clark Among the Indians, but also read the journals themselves. And yeah, read them with care and with awareness of all the biases and baggage that the writers carry with them, but they remain a remarkable document.
And they're available online. You can get the full journals online. I think Gary Moulton 13-volume series I have in my office, and you can also get the abridged edition, which I was in class. I used to say to students, for this class, you carry it around with you like the Bible, and you just keep dipping into it wherever. Now, you know, they're doing it online. That's more difficult, but I think it's a different kind of reading. It's not like, you know, you just read it cover to cover and then you're done. And I mean, because all these are turn of the century writing, their spelling, their punctuation, and is, well, it's like my students, you know, you have to sort of work at it sometimes.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all of you for participating in this, and thank Althea again for helping to pull this all together and to sustain us through all of this. So I will now turn it back over to Althea for final words.
Oh, we are so very grateful. Alan, Colin, Elizabeth, and Anne, thank you so much. What an engaging and enlightening conversation over the last 2 weeks. And today, the conversation on lessons learned about Jefferson's West was fantastic. So thank you all so very much. And we had over, Alan said about 100, a couple hundred people. We had over 6,000 alumni, parents, and friends that registered for this series over the last 2 weeks. So we appreciate all of you who took time out of your very busy days to watch and listen and learn. So audience, thank you for your attention. This is part of the Lifetime Learning team. I wanted to share a picture of us. This is behind the scenes. We're missing a couple people in the picture, but special thanks to Dana Mays, Ashley Gresh, Marilyn Musser, Keandra Morris, and Susan Lynch, and also Cindy Fredericks for your hard work and attention to details to make this summer series happen in 2021. Audience, visit our podcast library for the recordings of this series. They're being edited and should be available in the next week or so. We'll also try to push those out in an email to you when they're all available. But you can find it in our podcast library at alumni.virginia.edu/learn. Also find out more about all the Lifetime Learning programs, our Thoughts from the Lawn blog that comes out weekly, UVA Speaks, our podcast, and our online resources. We have many online